So a few years ago, 2 years ago in fact, we had the privilege of going on holiday, and we went to Cyprus on holiday, and we had a wonderful time. And while we were there, we decided that we would take a short flight from Cyprus over to Israel. So it's only an hour from Cyprus to Israel. So we decided to do that for a long weekend. And so we had our overnight bags and stuff, and we got on a plane to take us to Israel. And we booked in to stay at the Adventist church there in Jerusalem, because they had a hostel, so you can just stay, and they have all the facilities you need, so you can just stay there. And it's not too expensive. So we booked to stay in that hostel. Now, so we got on a plane, and the plane doesn't actually go to Jerusalem, it goes to Tel Aviv. So we landed in Tel Aviv. It was about midday or something, and we had all our stuff. And what I'd planned in advance that we would get to Tel Aviv airport, and we would take the bus over to Jerusalem, because the buses seem to be quite regular. So, okay, we'll just get on the bus, not too expensive, that's fine. Anyway, so we got to the bus stop at the airport, and it turns out the buses weren't that regular. So and the next bus was in about 2 hours' time, so that's not worth it really to wait that long. So we ended up biting the bullet and getting a taxi. Taxi to Jerusalem. We're in the taxi going along the motorway, and the driver says to us, where do you want to go? So we're going to Jerusalem. Whereabouts do you want to be dropped off? And I knew where we were going, the church hostel, which is near the King David Hotel, but we couldn't check in until about 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon. So we had quite a lot of time to kill and to see the city and things like that before we could go and check in and stuff like that. So I said, well, drop us at the market. I heard the market was a place to see, so I said, drop us there. We'll go and see there first. So, okay, that's fine. So he took us to the market, and there was quite a lot of traffic in the city. So we were there, and there was a lot of traffic, and he tells us, the market's just around the corner. Just walk down that street. It's just over there. I was like, you can jump out here if you want. So, okay, we'll jump out here. We jumped out of the taxi, got all our stuff out, the bags and the pram and all that, and then the taxi drove off. And it was at that point realized that we were in a new country, in a new city, been there for about an hour, and we have no map, no internet, and we're pretty much lost. So, and we had these very few directions just to go to the market. So we ended up, we're like, okay, we might as well just go to the market. So we went to the market, and it's amazing, really. If you get a chance, you should go and see it. But and once we'd experienced the market, we still had a few hours to go and to spend before we could go and check in at the hostel. And so we're like, well, where do we go? We don't actually know. We've never even been in the Middle East before, let alone in a new city, let alone try and find our way around without Google Maps. There's no internet. So, okay, well, and you realize that cities are very different. It's not like a UK city. So we kind of looked around, see where people were walking, like the main direction or the main high streets were. So we started to walk in that kind of general direction, and we came across a tram line. So then we walked along the tram line and found someone to have lunch and things like that. And then we went back to the tram line, and we found someone to talk to. And he said, if you want to get to the old city, which is we knew where that was, and that was the main attractions, the main places to go and see, and where our hostel was near, just carry on walking down the tram line. It's about 10, 15 minutes. So we did that, and we eventually found our way to the old city without using Google Maps. But that experience, the moment when we're just there, getting out of the taxi's just driven off, no maps, no internet, no directions, nothing. I think that's kind of the experience that you have when you enter adulthood, but without having experienced an absent father. You get to the stage in adulthood, you get to whatever it might, 18, 20, whatever it might be, and you realize that actually I'm not prepared for life. I don't know what to do. This life is happening around me, and now I have to make some decisions and take control of my own life, and I'm unprepared. I don't know what to do. I have no map. I have no example. And it's like that kind of, it's just, when you have an absent father, like I was talking about last week, there's no map, there's no roadmap, there's no directions, there's nothing. And you have to try and do it yourself. And it becomes very lonely. trying to find your way yourself all the time, trying to do the same, trying to make the decisions yourself. No one has showed you how to be an adult, or how to make certain decisions, or how to deal with certain emotions, how to deal with certain circumstances, how to perhaps deal with tension, or perhaps deal with relationships. And so you have to do it all yourself. And it becomes really lonely because you're having to constantly, there's no one to fall back on. There's no one who's guided you through that process before. And so it's a very lonely experience. But that's why I love this passage in Jeremiah 6:16, which, thanks you for reading. It says in Jeremiah 6:16, it says that there is an ancient path. God says you can choose to walk this ancient path. Have a choice. An ancient path means that people have walked it before. And it's a good way. It's a way that brings life, and a way that brings peace. And you can choose it. But not just ancient path, it goes against this idea of loneliness. It means that there's a community of people that have walked this path for thousands of years. There's millions of people who have done this journey before. And you can also be part of that. So you don't need to feel lonely anymore. Even if you grew up with an absent father, or even an absent mother of any kind. You can still walk this kind of communal journey together. And that's what I want to share a little bit about that this morning. That expand a bit on last week. So last week I was talking about what absent father looks like, a little bit about that. And this week I want to talk a little bit about the journey. So the different stages on that journey that this Jeremiah 6:16 is talking about. And there's a journey that goes from a state of complete absent fatherness, having no one, not having any life example, anything like that on one side. So all the way to the other side, where you experience and you live in the reality that God is your dad. But it doesn't happen overnight. I talked last week about a letter that I wrote to my dad and how that changed my outlook and things like that. But that didn't happen overnight. That was a process that probably took about 8 years. And so I want to talk through some of the stages along that process this morning. Process of the journey. It's a journey. It's an adventure. But there are different stages. There are different elements to that journey. Maybe like 5 years ago now, 5, 6 years ago, when I was living at Newbold over there in Keir House, I had a roommate, Bissa, and he had a car. It was one of those old Mark I Corsas that was basically just a go-kart with a roof. It was really fun to drive. Anyway, so he had this car, and we sometimes shared it, and we went to the shops and stuff. And then we started going to London quite regularly for the homeless thing. And we were driving this car to London and back. And we noticed that the car behaved slightly differently in traffic than it did in not traffic. And we began to notice that driving on the motorway, it was fine, the car was working normally, and then we stop in traffic, and then the engine temperature gauge would start to go up. And it would go up from 80 up to 90, up to 100. Sometimes it got to 110. And then we decided, we realized that we had to find something to stop this. So sometimes we turn the engine off, and that was fine. Or sometimes you put the heating fan up full, get all the hot air out, open the windows, that worked. Or you just, every time you're in traffic, you just turn the engine off, and then you're like, okay. But we didn't really know what to do, but that was like a quick fix solution we did at the time. But we didn't really do anything about it. That just happened for months. We carried on. And then a few months later, we were fixing something else with the car. The exhaust had actually fallen off. If you want a tip, actually it's not a tip, but if you don't have any money and want to fix an exhaust, coat hangers work really well. But anyway, so we're tying this exhaust back on with a coat hanger, and we had the bonnet up, and we were trying to test the engine and things like that, because we had no idea what we were doing. But we were testing the engine, and we realized at that point that the fan at the front of the engine was completely busted, didn't work at all. And that's why the car kept overheating, because every time we were driving on the motorway, the cool air was coming in and the engine was fine. But whenever we stopped, there was no cool air coming in. So the engine just overheated. And that, I think, that kind of idea that we were driving along in this car, knew that something was slightly wrong, but we hadn't done anything about it. That's like the first stage of this journey. The first stage of this journey is to acknowledge that there's a problem. We didn't acknowledge that there was a problem with the car. We didn't do anything about it until it was too late, until other stuff had gone wrong. And then we had to find a solution, which probably could have done a lot cheaper if we'd done it the first time. But the first stage on that journey, the stage one, the first hill that you have to climb, is to acknowledge, actually, you know what? I'm damaged. There is a problem with me. I'm broken. Somehow along the way, something happened to me, something in childhood, something happened and it's affected me. I'm not perfect. I'm weak. I have areas of vulnerability. And that, if you're living if you've experienced absent fatherhood, let's say, that can be really, really difficult. It's not easy, because if you've lived if you've had a childhood or a teenage experience of absent fatherhood in some way, whether it's a physical absent father or an emotional absent father, then what you've had to do is grow up too quickly. And you've had to make decisions by yourself and grow up and go through kind of emotional difficulties or emotional journeys by yourself without anyone guiding you through. And that means you've had to be strong when you basically didn't know what you were doing. And you had to put on this face of, I can do it by myself. I know what I'm doing. I can fix this alone. And that means that you grow up with this distorted sense of what it means to be an adult, or be a man, or perhaps be a woman. You grow up with this idea that being a man, I can talk about manhood by myself, but I'm sure for myself, but I'm sure it probably works the same way with being a woman. But being a man is showing no sign of weakness. Weakness is not manhood. Weakness is not manly. Vulnerability is not manly. So to get to a stage where you can actually say to yourself and say to God, yes, I'm damaged. Get to that hill one. That is a hill. That takes time. And it takes you to step back and to realize that being a man or being masculine or whatever it might be can involve weakness and can involve vulnerability. And it's not the end of the world to show vulnerability, to admit to yourself that I'm damaged in some way. So that's hill number one. Hill number two, once you've climbed that hill, you've got to that stage where you've realized that actually, yes, there is an issue with me. Hill number two is like a hill and a very low valley, because you have to then be able to express and articulate what that damage was. You can't just say, I'm damaged. God, fix me. It's not going to happen. I mean, God might do something, but you won't really see the effects until you know what He's actually fixed. It's like when you have a car and you're driving, everyone knows when they're driving a car and something's slightly not quite right with the car. It's not accelerating as it should do. It's not braking properly. It's not steering correctly. Something's slightly wrong with the car, but you don't know. You're not clever enough to. Haven't got that expertise to know exactly what's wrong with the car at the time of driving. So what you do is you take it to the garage, you tell the garage what's gone wrong and what your experience is, and then they have a look at it, and they tell you, oh, it's the brakes need replacing, or it needs new engine spark plugs, or it needs a new change of oil. And then you can go and fix it. Stage two in this journey is not acknowledging. Once you've done that, you've got to then articulate what your damage is. You have to articulate your wound, because everyone has received a wound of some kind. Number one is to acknowledge that you were wounded. Number two is to express it. Actually express it. I was wounded this way. Because we're all wounded slightly differently. And we don't just receive lots and lots of different wounds. It will be just one or two that keep happening again and again and again. And so to get over that second hill, you have to do a lot of digging, and it's actually really painful. And you have to pray, and you have to ask God to reveal and to bring back to your mind certain memories that were really painful. Because you don't actually, you've suppressed them, you've buried them, because you don't want to experience them ever again. You kind of moved on. But you have to get over this second stage, to be able to say to God, or say to yourself, this is exactly where I was wounded. You have to bring those memories back to mind. I just want to share a little bit about how I personally did that. Up to how you personally go about doing that is up to you. And share a little bit about how, where my wounds were. And then I want to give you a little bit of time to think before I carry on about what your wounds might be. So I was going through this process. I'd realized that there was something wrong with me, that I wasn't fully developed, that there was something missing, something that I hadn't received as a child. And I was reading books about childhood psychology and what that meant and things like this, but I'd never really dug deep into my own past and dug up some painful memories and looked at what that might have done along the process. I remember one day I was reading this book by a psychologist called Alice Miller. And I remember I was reading it, and God just said, you need to do that. You need to go tonight and spend some time digging up your own past. I was like, okay, if I have to. And if it happened that I was actually home alone that night, so I couldn't even blame, my kids for not having the time to do that. But anyway, so I had the time. And so I got a journal, which is something that I recommend. I was like, okay, God, you just bring up the memories, and I'll just write it down. And so I spent about 2 or 3 hours just writing, continually writing, different memories, different experiences. I wasn't even thinking that much. God was just bringing them to my mind. I was just writing down. Conversations, different experiences. And it got to about, 2.5 hours, something like that. And really, I kind of came to an end. I came to a stop. And I had that opportunity then, once you've written it all down, to read through it, to see what has happened, to see what's gone wrong. And you realize where your wounds have been. And I realized for myself that there were two major areas of wounds. The first one, which I touched on last week, which is the idea that you were never good enough. I was never good enough. There was never a moment where I'd hear those words, I'm proud of you. I'm proud of you, son. I'm proud of what you've done. Or I'm proud of who you are. Never heard those words. So it's just this constant, there was always constant something. Even though I had achievements and things like that, there was always a next thing, or, oh, you need to hear something do something better here. And so there was never this peace that I realized I was okay. No. The wound was, you're not good enough. The way you are, you're not good enough. And then there was this other wound, which I think is related to Adventism in some way. It was this wound of shame around anything remotely physical or sexual within a relationship. The way one of my parents and other family members kind of talked to me about, or the way they spoke, not even just to me, but in general, meant that anything to do with relationships, girls, sexuality, even not even remotely, even just talking to girls as a teenager, that's a crime in itself. Don't even go there. You're going straight to hell if you even say hello. So don't even bother. There was such a shame and around that area of my life, and that meant that to have conversations required thinking that my soul wanting just conversations with other people, having feelings that every teenager has. Something in my soul and my heart said, actually, those feelings or wanting those conversations, that's a sin. That's dirty. You should never do that. And so there's a wound. And I think I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but I think it's maybe something, it has a connection with church culture, perhaps, I don't know. But there's a shame culture around relationships, sexuality, those kinds of things. And I think it affects young people like it affected me. And so those were two areas that I realized, actually, yes, there had been an impact. There had been something wrong. There had been damage. I just want to give you a couple of minutes to think about your own self. And maybe just pray, take some time, close your eyes, and just think, what might your wound be? Because in order to move forward, in order to experience what God as a dad really means for you, you have to know what wounds you received. So just take 2 minutes before I carry on. Abandonment. Embarrassment. Inconvenience. Disappointment. Not good enough. So once you got over that, once you've realized what your wound might be, just hold on. Once you've realized what your wound might be, then you can, once you've climbed that hill and you've gone through the valley of soul searching and digging up those kind of painful memories, then you can move on to stage 3, which is like a jungle. And it's, once you've realized that your wound, that you've been wounded and you've expressed what those wounds are, what kind of the other side of the coin to those wounds is the origin of those wounds, is the lie that goes with them. And once you've received the wound, whatever it might have been, there's a lie that goes with it, which is that you were wounded because it's true. You were wounded because it's true. You are fill in the blank. And you were wounded because it's actually true. And stage 3, this is the first point. This is like a jungle. That's I'm calling it a jungle because you don't know where you're going to be attacked from. This is the first. Stage 3 is the first part where you start attacking back, and you have to stand up and you have to say to the devil, "That is a lie. That is a lie." Whatever it might have been about yourself, you have to call it out. It was a lie. I am good enough. Because the Bible says that God loves me. And the Bible says that even while I was still a sinner, God died for me. I am good enough. It's a lie. It might be, I will never, the lie might have been, you're not worth anyone sticking around for you. You're always going to be abandoned. You have to call that out. That's a lie as well. Because the Bible says that God is with you till the end of time. It might have been that you're unlovable. You have to call that out as a lie. The Bible says that God loves you. But the lie might have been that you're an inconvenience, or you're just a waste of space, or you're a mistake. You have to call it out as a lie because the Bible says that you were created in the image of God. And that verse in Jeremiah says that God has a plan for you to prosper and go on. He wants to encourage you. You have to call these lies out for what they are. And it's like a jungle because this is the point where you start fighting back. And this is the point where the devil gets serious. And this is the point where it's like a jungle because you don't know where you're going to be attacked from. These lies are going to come back from different places you didn't even think they would come from, and you're going to have to fight them. It's like jungle warfare. But you have to speak into those lies. You have to call them out for what they are. And once you've called out what those lies were, then there is a signpost. Once you've gone through that jungle warfare, then there is a signpost. A signpost that gives you two options. One says to continue as normal, status quo. Carry on along the path as if nothing had happened. The other one, once you've called out those lies, the other one says God's new narrative. And if you take that signpost, if you take the path that says God's new narrative, then you have to start living in the reality that God is your dad. This is the part where we talked about last week. This is the part where adoption really happens, where you start to live and experience and believe that God is your dad. And you have to start taking those questions and those lies, and you take them to God and you say, God, is this true? You have to start taking your questions. God, as my dad now, what do you think of me? Are you, God, are you proud of me? God, do you love me? God, as my dad, fill in the blank. And to live in the new reality, to live in this new narrative, you have to find your identity as God's son or God's daughter. And that means that you have to take your questions to God and hear an answer and believe it. You have to wait for an answer. You have to let God be the dad that he wants to be and answer your questions. And you have to experience that. This is where the fullness of adoption starts to come in. The full reality of adoption starts to come in. Because once you start living in this new identity and this new reality, then God starts giving you a new future. And this is where this is so, like, this runs deep, because up until this point, your whole life story, your adult life story, however long it might have been, has been based on the lies that you believed about yourself. Based on the wounds you received, and therefore the lies about yourself. Because those wounds, they run deep. They go to the core of who you are. It's not just something that happened in childhood. It's not just an experience that happened in childhood that you've forgotten about many years ago. It becomes your core sense of identity. You live, you make decisions, you go through relationships, whatever it might be. You build a career even on the identity that you've formed on the wound. You try and work through it by yourself. You try and make up for it. The wound might be you're not good enough. So you keep striving, you build a whole career, like you get to the top job just so that someone's going to say, I'm proud of me. They're proud of me. But it doesn't work, never works. Or your wound might have been you're unlovable, or you're just going to be abandoned, or whatever that might be. So you go through life looking, searching for that, somebody to say that they love you, And so you go from relationship to relationship, or whatever it might be. And you base your whole life, you make your whole decisions based on the wound. And unless you do anything about it, that will just carry on as normal. And so that's why this signpost, to take God's new identity and to live in reality that God is your dad, is so important. Because at this point, once you believe that, once you've heard God say what he thinks about you as his son or as his daughter, then he starts to give you a new future based on a different identity. You might have to make changes, but those changes are okay, because God is now your dad. So it doesn't matter what's happened before. Those life decisions, whatever they might have been, they were based on a lie. But now you're living your life based on God's truth about who you are. And that's the shift. That's where you have to take that signpost and live in that reality. Live in that experience and know daily that God is your dad and what that means for you personally. And also as a bonus, in this experience, when you take that signpost, God's now your dad, you've got your new reality, and you're living in this identity that God is your father, you also join a community. It also brings a new community to your life. There's new people. You walk in this ancient path that millions of people have already walked, and you can tap into them. You can tap into them. It might be through people you know. You can talk to people you know about what a new reality, what living with God looks like. People who you see who live like that, you can talk to them. They can become your mentors. God brings in new people into your life that are like fathers. And they might just be needed for a couple of months or a couple of years, and then they disappear into other scenarios, other circumstances. But God brings in people for that new identity when you need them. When you're living in that with God as your dad, he brings in new people for you to lead you in a new direction. It also gives you the opportunity to tap into resources that other people along the way have left behind. Books, podcasts, different Bible stories, things like that. There's plenty to tap into to live in this new reality. You don't have to do it by yourself. That's the amazing thing. You don't have to do it by yourself anymore. Millions of people have already done it. And they've left stories, and they've left tips, and they've told you how to do it. And only once you've taken that signpost, and only once you're 100% secure in that reality, can you then go on to stage 5 and stage 6, which is like an abseil down 2 cliffs. And I told you that at the beginning, that the journey it took me to go from complete absent father to then be able to write a letter to my dad and seek some kind of reconciliation was about 8 years. And we're still only at stage 4. But stage 5 and stage 6 is about reconciliation. 2 types of reconciliation. 2 types of reconciliation. Reconciliation, stage 5, the first cliff, is with yourself. You have to release yourself. And this is where you realize that actually, if you don't do this, you will become, maybe you already are, part of the wound cycle. Because the wounds and the lies, unless they're dealt with, unless you stop them, they just go from generation to generation to generation. They keep going, unless somebody stops it. And no one's ever perfect, true. No one's ever going to get it right. No one's ever going to raise their kids in a perfect way and stop all this mess. But you can stop the wound from passing on, at least in some way. You can be intentional about it. Because if you don't, you'll just be part of that wound. Whether you realize it or not, you might have this idea that I'm going to be nothing like my parents. I'm going to be the exact opposite they are. But unless you actually go through this process, No matter how far you run away, even to another country, and do things in a different language, you end up being the same. It's psychologically sound. It's going to happen. And I want to share at this point a little example of what that looks like. I know I've talking a lot about myself, so I'm not going to talk about myself again. Probably bored of talking about me. But I just want to share an example of my wife's family. And she said that's okay, so I'm not in trouble. But so her dad has very low sense of self-esteem, very low sense of self-worth. He's struggles with different things, with emotional difficulties. And not only that, but he struggles with relationship difficulties, and he struggles with tensions and dealing with conflict in relationships, with his kids, with other people. He's kind of fearful of conflict. He's afraid of conflict. And in relationships with his partners or with his wife, he sometimes behaves very much like a childish behavior, because he's so desperate to be needed that he just behaves in a way that people are going to need him, people are going to want him, and he gets that kind of affirmation that way. And this is still continuing. This continues throughout his adult life. And it doesn't take away from the fact that he's done the best he can, he's very clever, he can do things by himself, but he still kind of has this deep need to whatever it might be like a simple task, like a DIY task at home, but somebody will have to help him. He won't just do it himself. He won't just fix something himself. Somebody will have to come and help him out, or do it with him, or say that's giving some kind of approval. So I was asking Rachel, like, where do you think that came from? She was talking about her grandparents, so her dad's parents, and how they just can't. They're very, very similar in a way, but they can't deal with conflict either. They just joke about it, whatever it might be. Even a small issue between grandkids is just something that's made into a joke. Or they also don't know how to deal with people when they're going through particularly negative emotions like sadness or upset or disappointment. They don't know how to put their arm around someone and comfort them, things like that. It's just everything is not dealt with in the right way, in a healthy, respectful kind of way. And so you see how things pass from generation to generation if they're not stopped with and dealt with. There's a cycle, a wound cycle. And stage 5 is this idea that you can release yourself. You can stop being a part of that wound cycle because you're living in this new reality that God is your dad. So you can live in his identity. You can know you live as if he gives you life. And you can stop being part of the wound cycle. You can change. You have the ability, you have the foundation now of your soul is based on something different. It's based on truth, not on lie anymore. And so you can behave differently. You can live differently, and you're not having to worry about whether you kind of need an approval all the time, or you have these emotional needs that God is meeting, no one else. And you've called out the lies for what they are. So that's the 5th stage. And the final stage, now because you're living, and only now, because you're living in God's new reality for who you are, not for who anyone else is, but for who you are. Now, if it's possible, and it might not be possible for everyone, now you can try and find some kind of reconciliation with the person who gave you the wounds in the first place. Whether it was a dad, a mum, family member, a friend. Now, if that's possible, you can try and attempt to find some kind of reconciliation. Whether it's like me and you write a letter and get them to share their experience. Whether you pick up the phone and you have a phone call. Whether you have a coffee. and have a conversation. But only at this stage can you make that, can you have that conversation or try and make that happen. And I admit, for some people that's not possible. The time is gone, the opportunity's passed. Or you know that if you do try and have that conversation, it's not going to go the way you want. And you're not going to get the answers you really needed. But at this stage, once you've gone through the whole process, it's okay if that stage doesn't work. If it does work, it's marvelous. If it doesn't work, you haven't lost anything because you're still living now, living in a new reality. You're not basing your life on the lies and the wounds. You're living with God as your dad. So what happens with your earthly parents or family has less of an impact, has less of an impact. And so and it's important you get them in the right order, because if you go straight to stage 6 and straight to trying to have that conversation with somebody, you could end up even worse than when you first started. Conversation could go horribly wrong, and you end up in a far worse position. So it's important that you go through the stages in the right order. It's important that you make sure you live in with God first before you try and reconcile yourself and release yourself from whatever it was, from the wound cycle, and before you try and release the other person. And you can only do that because you realize that the other person, that whoever gave you those wounds in the first place, is also part of the wound cycle. You realize that actually one of the things my dad told me in this letter, which he never told to me in person, but that he finds it difficult to talk to me about these kinds of personal things because his dad never spoke to him about them. And so it's just a cycle. And you kind of feel a little bit of compassion for that person. Even though they wounded you, you feel a little bit of compassion for them. And you're able to release them and give them a bit of freedom. So those are the 6 stages. Acknowledging that there is a problem. Acknowledging that you're not perfect and that you're damaged in some way. Then you articulate it. What is it? What exactly was it? What was the wound? What was said about you? What was done to you? Number 3 is you call it out as a lie. Call it out as a lie because it's not true. It was not God's original intention for you to end up like this. Number 4 is you take that signpost that says God's new narrative and you start to live in the new community of being a child, being a son or being a daughter of God. And what that means and all the people that go with that. Number 5, you have the ability then to release yourself from the wound cycle. You can change your behavior and live differently, live in a more healthy way, live in a more positive way. And finally, at the end, if it's possible, you have the opportunity to release and have reconciliation with whoever it was that wounded you in the first place. As an adult now. As an adult. So those are the 6 stages, just in brief recap. And so my appeal is very simple. I've heard the 6 stages. And it's not just me that's saying these, it's based on a lot of books and other people, and I can recommend loads. But it's not just me saying these. You've heard the 6 stages, and if you're serious about wanting to go from one end where your heart or your soul or your identity has been stolen by some wounds and some lies. And the only person who steals things is, John 10, verse 10, Jesus says, the only person who steals things is the thief. And the thief is the devil. And if you realize that you're at that stage where your identity has been stolen by lies, and you want to live in the other reality where the other half of that verse in John 10, verse 10 says that Jesus comes, and as a father he comes to give you life to the full. If you want to live in that reality, and you want to go through that process, then my appeal is very simple, that you tell somebody. You tell somebody who you know is going to help you through that process. Take it seriously. Take God seriously. Take God as your dad seriously. And you tell somebody. Tell anyone. Tell anyone who you think can help you along that process. Friend, family member, someone at church, elder, pastor, whoever it might be. Tell somebody so that they can help you through that process. It might take 8, 10, 15, 20 years, but it's worth it. And so my appeal is that you take it seriously and you tell somebody. Because God will change you, and he will be your dad. He wants to. But you have to first make the move to accept God and go through the process with someone else. It's always easier with someone else. Families travel together. So, if you are serious about it, then tell someone before it's too late.